Ilara thought her life was finally falling into place. A quiet future, a simple dream, a love she trusted with her whole heart. But in a single moment, everything shattered. The man she believed would protect her revealed a truth so cruel it stole the air from her lungs. She wasn't his partner, she was his payment, sold like an object to a reclusive billionaire known only for his cold fortune and darker intentions. Forced into a mansion where silence felt like chains and every shadow watched her, Ilara realized something terrifying. This was no misunderstanding. This was a trap. And the man waiting behind those iron gates didn't want her obedience. He wanted to test something far more dangerous. What she discovers inside those walls will destroy everything she thought she knew, including the truth about herself. It was the day every one of her simple dreams was supposed to come true. For Ilara, life had always been a quiet tapestry woven with threads of hardship, but she found beauty in its humble patterns. She saw art in the frost on a window pane and music in the rain against the roof of her small apartment. Her heart, resilient and full of a gentle empathy, had found its anchor in Liam. He was her salvation, the man who promised to build a fortress of love around her, protecting her from the struggles of a world that had always demanded more than it gave. Today, they were meant to solidify that future, to lay the first stone of a life together. But as she stood before him, her smile as bright as the single, hopeful ray of sun piercing through the clouds, the foundation of her world began to crumble into dust. Liam's face was a mask of torment she didn't recognize. The easy charm she had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollowed-out greed that made her stomach clench. He couldn't meet her eyes. His words, when they finally came, were not a declaration of love, but a confession of the most unthinkable betrayal. He spoke of debt, a chasm so deep it had swallowed him whole. A debt not to a bank or a loan shark, but to a man who was a ghost in his own family, his estranged uncle, a notoriously cruel and reclusive billionaire whose name was only ever spoken in fearful whispers. The man's fortune was legendary, a vast empire built on ruthless decisions and an utter disregard for human connection. His wealth was a weapon, and Liam had walked directly into its line of fire. To save himself, Liam had made a deal. The words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. He had bargained with the one thing he had left of any value. He had bargained with her. The arrangement was a nightmare painted in vague, terrifying strokes. She was to be delivered to the billionaire's secluded mansion, a sprawling Gothic estate on the edge of the coast. For 1 month, she would live there, a guest in name but a prisoner in reality, bound to abide by the whims of a man she had never met. She was not a person in this transaction. She was collateral, a glorified possession used to settle a score between two men. A life for a debt, her spirit for his freedom. There was no one to call, no safe harbor to run to. Her family was a collection of faded photographs and distant memories. Her resources were non-existent. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Liam's justifications were a meaningless drone in her ears, his pleas for understanding turning to ash on his tongue. All she could see was the end of everything she had believed in. The love she thought was her shield had become the very cage that now entrapped her. An hour later, a sleek black car, silent as a predator, pulled up to her curb. There were no goodbyes, only the cold, final click of a car door shutting her inside. The journey was a blur of muted colors and a suffocating silence, each mile pulling her further from the life she knew and deeper into a terrifying unknown. The car finally slowed, turning onto a private road shrouded by ancient, overgrown trees that blotted out the sky. And then she saw it. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a fortress of stone and shadow, a monument to isolation. It loomed against the grey sky, its windows like vacant eyes, staring out at a world it wanted no part of. Immense iron gates, ornate and menacing, groaned open to admit them, their screech the sound of a prison door locking. As the car rolled up the long, winding driveway, Ilara looked back. The gates swung shut with a deafening clang, the sound echoing through the manicured grounds, sealing her inside. Her dreams of love and security had not just faded, they had been violently extinguished, leaving behind only the cold and dark ash of a life that was no longer her own. This was not a new beginning, it was the start of her captivity. Life inside the mansion was a lesson in oppressive silence. The air itself seemed heavy, muted by thick carpets and tapestries that swallowed every sound. Marble halls stretched out like cold, polished canyons, reflecting a ghostly version of her as she walked through them. She was a ghost here, a spectre in a palace of shadows, attended to by a staff that moved with silent, unnerving efficiency. They were polite but distant, their eyes holding a mixture of professional indifference and a flicker of something that might have been pity, which only made her feel smaller. They would leave meals for her on pristine china in a cavernous dining room where she always ate alone, the clinking of her fork against the plate echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. The master of the house, the billionaire who had bought her for a month, was an even greater phantom. She felt his presence in the perfect arrangement of every object, in the chilling order of the estate, but she did not see him. His existence was a weight in the atmosphere, a constant unseen pressure that reminded her of her status as an acquisition. He was a man whose vast fortune was a living, breathing entity, a force that had bent the world to his will and had now, so easily, bent her life into this broken shape. The sheer scale of his wealth was on display everywhere, from the priceless art on the walls to the flawless gardens outside, yet it all felt dead. A monument to a man who had traded warmth for assets, her days blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and loneliness. She would wake in a bed larger than her entire childhood room, the silk sheets cool against her skin, and for a fleeting moment she would forget where she was. Then the silence would rush in, and the reality of her situation would crash down on her like a physical blow. The internal conflict was a raging storm. One moment, she was paralyzed by the sense of worthlessness Liam's betrayal had branded onto her soul. He had looked at her, the woman he claimed to love, and saw only a solution to a financial problem, a piece of capital to be liquidated. The next moment, a stubborn, unyielding spark of defiance would flare within her, a refusal to be extinguished by the darkness surrounding her. She was more than a transaction. She had to be. A few days into her imprisonment, Liam came to visit. Oberon, a stupid, treacherous thing, flickered in her chest when a stern housekeeper announced his arrival. Perhaps he had come to his senses. Perhaps he had found another way. But the hope died the moment he walked into the sitting room where she was told to wait for him. He didn't look remorseful. He looked irritated, entitled. "Ilara," he began, not as a greeting, but as a command for her attention. "You need to understand. This is for the best." She stared at him, unable to form words. He paced in front of the cold fireplace, his hands gesturing wildly. "My uncle, he's not a man you reason with. His entire life has been about business, about profit and loss. He sees people as numbers on a balance sheet. This debt I had, it was nothing to his overall net worth, a rounding error, but to him it was a matter of principle, a bad investment he needed to correct. And I am the correction," she finally whispered, her voice raw. "You are the solution," he snapped, his voice rising. "This is a chance for both of us. You live in luxury for a month, and I get a clean slate. He gets whatever it is he wants out of this deal. Everyone wins." His words dripped with a sickening possessiveness, as if he still had some claim on her, as if her compliance was his right. He was making it clear that she was his pawn, a piece he had strategically sacrificed in a game she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a hand squeezing the air from her lungs. After he left, the mansion's silence felt more profound, more suffocating than ever. The walls seemed to close in, the opulent furniture mocking her with its cold beauty. This was her gilded cage, and the man who had put her in it had just stopped by to remind her to sing. That night, her spirit finally threatened to break. She curled up on a window seat, overlooking the storm-tossed sea, feeling as lost and battered as the waves crashing against the cliffs below. But resilience is a strange and stubborn thing. It often finds root in the most desolate soil. The next day, unable to bear the confines of the house any longer, she wrapped herself in a coat she found in a closet and stepped out into the manicured grounds. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her past perfect rose bushes and stoic statues until she found herself at the far end of the property, behind a high stone wall covered in ivy. There, almost completely hidden from view, was a large glass structure, its panes clouded with grime and neglect. A conservatory, drawn by an unexplainable pull. She found the door unlocked and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was a graveyard of plants. Wilted vines hung like skeletons from the rafters, and pots were filled with the dry, brown husks of what were once vibrant flowers. The space was forgotten, abandoned, left to die. And in its desolation, Ilara saw a reflection of her own heart. But as she looked closer, she saw a single, stubborn green shoot pushing its way through the cracked soil of a neglected planter. A tiny, impossible flicker of life in a world of death. In that moment, something shifted inside her. Tending to the dying things in this glass house wouldn't change her circumstances, but it would be an act of creation in a world of destruction. It would be hers. This small corner of the vast, cold estate would be a place she could control, a place she could bring back to life. It was a quiet rebellion, the first seed of her slow, arduous journey back to herself. Her work in the conservatory became her sanctuary. She would spend hours there, her hands deep in the cool, dark soil, clearing away the dead and nurturing the living. Each new leaf that unfurled, each bud that swelled with the promise of a flower, was a small victory against the oppressive gloom of the estate. It was a methodical, grounding labor that quieted the storm in her mind. Here, she wasn't a commodity that had been traded. She was a creator, a restorer of life. The vast wealth that surrounded her meant nothing in this glass house. A plant didn't care about dollars or euros. It cared only for sunlight, water, and gentle hands. It was during one of these afternoons, while coaxing a stubborn vine onto a trellis, that she first felt his eyes on her. She turned to see the billionaire standing in the doorway, a tall, severe silhouette against the bright light outside. He was as immaculate and cold as his marble halls, his face an unreadable mask of indifference. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply observing her, his gaze sweeping over the burgeoning life in the room. "I see you've found a way to occupy your time," he said finally, his voice low and devoid of warmth. It wasn't a question or a compliment, it was a flat statement of fact, as if he were assessing the performance of one of his many assets. Ilara's hands froze on the vine. "It was being neglected," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his features before vanishing. "Everything on this estate serves a purpose or is left to decay. Ensure your project proves to be a worthwhile investment of your time." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her with the chilling implication that she, too, was expected to prove her worth. His rare appearances followed this pattern, brief, cutting, and designed to reinforce her status as a purchased object. He never used her name, referring to her only as the girl, or in the context of the arrangement. As the days bled into weeks, Ilara began to notice the mansion's deeper secrets. There was a specific wing on the second floor that was always dark, its heavy oak door perpetually locked. The staff never went near it, their paths diverting around it as if by an unspoken rule. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was steeped in an almost unbearable silence, she thought she could hear something from that direction, the faint, melancholic echo of a piano, a melody so full of sorrow it made her heart ache. It was always fleeting, gone before she could be certain she hadn't imagined it. One afternoon, a senior housekeeper named Martha, a woman with kind, weary eyes who had watched Ilara with quiet pity, found her standing near the forbidden door. Ilara didn't have to say anything. Martha simply pressed a cool, ornate brass key into her palm, her fingers lingering for a moment in a gesture of solidarity. "Some doors are locked to keep memories in, not people out," the old woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Ilara with the heavy key in her hand and a heart hammering against her ribs. That night, Ilara waited until the house was asleep. The key felt like a burning coal in her pocket. Every instinct screamed at her to stay in her room, to not provoke the man who held her fate in his hands. But the music, the locked door, the housekeeper's cryptic words, it was a mystery that pulled at her, a thread that might lead to some kind of understanding of this gilded cage. Taking a deep breath, she crept through the darkened halls to the forbidden wing. The key slid into the lock with a soft, metallic click that sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. She pushed the door open, and it swung inward without a sound. The air that met her was still and cool, carrying the faint scent of lavender and dust. It was a suite of rooms, perfectly preserved but shrouded in a thin layer of time. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating furniture draped in white cloths like ghosts in slumber. It was not a prison, it was a shrine. On a small writing desk by the window, a leather-bound book lay open as if its reader had just stepped away. Ilara approached it hesitantly, her fingers tracing the elegant script on the page. It was a diary. It belonged to the billionaire's late wife. With trembling hands, Ilara began to read. The pages revealed a man she couldn't recognize. The words painted a portrait not of a cold-hearted tyrant, but of a husband consumed by a deep, profound love. He was a man who laughed, who brought his wife wildflowers, who called her his North Star and his only true fortune. The diary was filled with their shared dreams, their private jokes, and her own passionate entries about the life they were building. And then Ilara found it, page after page, detailing her love for a specific, exceptionally rare species of orchid, a flower her husband had traveled the world to find for her, a living symbol of his devotion. Ilara sank into the desk chair, the diary in her lap, her world tilting on its axis. The cold monster who held her captive, the ruthless multimillionaire who saw people as entries on a ledger, had once been this man, a man capable of a love so powerful it felt alive on the page. The discovery didn't answer any questions. It created 1,000 more, the most pressing of which echoed in the silent, moonlit room. How could that man have become the one who now held her prisoner? Clutching the diary to her chest, Ilara slipped back through the silent halls, the secret of the book, a heavy, burning weight within her. The mansion no longer felt just like a prison, but a mausoleum of a great love. And its warden was not a monster, but a ghost haunted by his own past. This new knowledge changed everything. Her work in the conservatory took on a new meaning. It was no longer just an act of defiance for her own sanity. It became a quiet, reverent tribute to the woman who had written those words, the woman who had loved a man who no longer seemed to exist. She found herself searching for any sign of the rare orchid mentioned in the diary, hoping to find a dormant root or a forgotten seed she could bring back to life. The billionaire began to notice the shift in her. The conservatory was no longer just showing signs of life. It was becoming a vibrant splash of color against the estate's monochrome palette. He said nothing, but his presence became more frequent. She would catch glimpses of him watching her from a distance, from a second-story window, or standing partially obscured by a row of ancient yews. His expression was no longer one of cold indifference. It was something far more complex, an unreadable mixture of scrutiny and something that looked unnervingly like pain. The silent war between them was evolving, the tension coiling tighter with each passing day. A few nights later, she was summoned to dinner. It was the first time he had requested her presence since her arrival. The cavernous dining room felt even larger, with two people seated at opposite ends of a ridiculously long table. The silence was broken only by the faint clinking of silverware on porcelain. He observed her over the rim of his wineglass, his eyes dark and penetrating. "The staff informs me you have a talent for horticulture," he stated, his voice as cool and sterile as the room. "I just like to see things grow," Elara answered simply, refusing to be intimidated. It was then that a young servant, clearing away the first course, made a fateful, careless comment. "It's true, sir," the young man said with a nervous smile. "The conservatory hasn't looked this beautiful in years. The girl has even started to revive some of the old orchids. It's like she's bringing Mrs. Thorne's garden back." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. The billionaire's hand, which was reaching for his glass, froze mid-air. For a split second, the mask of cold control shattered completely. A wave of raw, unguarded agony washed over his face, so profound it was like a physical blow. His eyes squeezed shut, and a muscle in his jaw clenched violently. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment of vulnerability, but Elara saw it all. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The iron mask slammed back into place, colder and more impenetrable than before. He shot the terrified servant a look so venomous the young man nearly dropped his tray before scurrying from the room. The rest of the dinner passed in a silence that was thick with unspoken grief. But for Elara, that single, unguarded moment was a confirmation. The diary hadn't been a fantasy. The man who had once moved mountains for a rare flower was still in there, buried alive under a mountain of his own wealth and sorrow. That realization ignited a new kind of fire within her. She was not just a pawn in a cruel game. She was a witness to a tragedy, and she would not be silent any longer. The next day, she found him in his library, a vast room lined with thousands of books that seemed to do nothing to warm the space. She walked in without being announced, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He looked up from a ledger detailing his vast portfolio of stocks and bonds, his eyes narrowing at her intrusion. "I need to know why," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Why are you doing this? This arrangement. It isn't about Liam's debt. A man with your net worth wouldn't even notice that amount of money. So what is this really about?" He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers, his expression unreadable. "You are impertinent. And you are cruel," she shot back, emboldened by the truth she now suspected. "But it's a performance, isn't it? This cold, ruthless billionaire act. I saw your face last night. This is about her." His composure finally cracked. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. For a moment, she thought he might lash out, but instead a strange, weary look crossed his face. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated," he said, his voice losing some of its icy edge. He walked to the window, staring out at the grey sea. "This was never about the money," he admitted, his voice low. "The arrangement, as you call it, was a test, a meticulously planned one." Elara stared, her mind struggling to process his words. "A test. I've known for years that my nephew was a worthless degenerate, a liability with no moral compass," he continued, his tone laced with contempt. "His greed was a cancer. The deal was a gambit, yes, but not to recoup a trivial sum. It was to expose his depravity beyond any doubt, to see just how low he would sink. He didn't just offer me assets or a percentage of some future business. He offered me a person. He turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers. But that was only half of the test. The other half was you. I needed to see what kind of person you were. I was testing your character, your resilience, your spirit. I needed to see if you would break. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical shock. She wasn't a victim of a cruel transaction. She was the subject of a cold, calculated experiment. The fear of being a mere object was suddenly replaced by a tidal wave of fury at being so profoundly manipulated. The freedom from one cage had only plunged her into another, far more complex and uncertain. His motives were still shrouded in shadow. But one thing was clear. She was no longer just the poor girl who had been sold. The news of his uncle's true intentions and the subsequent severing of all financial ties reached Liam not as a quiet notification, but as a roaring inferno that consumed what was left of his world. He had been played, exposed, and cast aside not for a debt, but for a principle. The fury that seized him was primal and absolute. In his twisted mind, the blame landed squarely on Ilara. She was supposed to be his compliant, silent solution, the key to unlocking his uncle's vast patrimonio. Instead, she had somehow become the instrument of his downfall. He saw her resilience not as a virtue, but as a betrayal of their agreement. Driven by a desperate, spiteful rage, he found a way back onto the estate grounds late one night, scaling a section of the stone wall far from the main gate. His target was singular and clear: the conservatory. It was her sanctuary, the one place she had poured her soul into. He would poison her Eden, smash her small pocket of hope, and remind her that she was nothing without him. He burst through the glass door like a phantom of destruction. The peaceful, humid air, fragrant with blooming life, was an affront to his chaotic fury. With a guttural roar, he began his rampage. Pots were shattered against the stone floor, their soil and roots spilling out like entrails. Delicate blossoms were torn from their stems, their vibrant colors crushed under his heel. He ripped vines from their trellises, turning a space of careful creation into a scene of violent chaos. This wasn't just about destroying plants. It was about annihilating the very symbol of her spirit, the one thing that had flourished while he withered. In the center of the conservatory stood a massive, ancient terracotta planter that Ilara had struggled for days to move into the perfect spot of sunlight. It held the most promising of the orchids she had been nursing back to health. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline and malice, Liam shoved it with all his might. The heavy pot tipped, crashing to the floor with a deafening boom that echoed through the night. It shattered into a dozen pieces, the orchid's delicate roots exposed and torn. But its fall did something else. The immense weight and impact dislodged a section of the old flagstone floor beneath it. A single stone was knocked loose, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath. Breathing heavily, his rage momentarily forgotten and replaced by a greedy curiosity, Liam knelt down. He reached into the hole and his fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled out a small, locked box, heavy and ornate, its surface tarnished with age. The lock was old but sturdy. He didn't have the key, but his desperation was a tool all its own. He found a discarded iron trowel and, with several violent blows, pried the box open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were not jewels or ouro, but a stack of legal documents and a bundle of letters tied with a silk ribbon. Liam's eyes scanned the papers, his mind racing. They were legal instruments, letters from the late Mrs. Thorne to her lawyers. They detailed her final wishes, and one document stood out, the charter for a private trust. It was a substantial one, a portion of her personal fortuna set aside, but the terms were highly specific. The trust and the considerable ativos it contained was to be activated and its beneficiary named only upon the successful cultivation and blooming of a single, specific species, the same impossibly rare orchid mentioned in her diary, the very one he had just destroyed. The conflict, which had been a cold war of silence and manipulation, was about to escalate into an all-out legal assault. Liam, seeing the documents, didn't see a tribute to a lost love. He saw a loophole. He saw a new source of capital. He was no longer just a spurned nephew. He was a man with a claim. Days later, Ilara was served with a legal notice. Liam was launching a formal challenge. He claimed that their original deal was made under extreme duress, that his uncle had coerced him, and that Ilara, a vulnerable woman with no means, was the true victim. He was positioning himself as her rightful guardian, her protector, attempting to seize legal control over her and, by extension, any potential fiancé she might be entitled to. He presented a seemingly ironclad document, a pre-nuptial agreement they had signed months ago that contained broad, vaguely worded clauses about mutual bends and decision-making, now twisted to serve his new narrative. The walls, which had just begun to recede, slammed shut around Ilara once more. Her brief moment of hope, of understanding, was threatened by a new cage, not of stone and iron, but of legal jargon and public manipulation. A sophisticated trap she had no resources or knowledge to fight. The legal documents felt heavier than chains, each word of legalese a link in a new, more insidious form of bondage. Liam's audacity was breathtaking. He had painted a narrative of himself as a savior, a valiant hero trying to rescue a damsel in distress from the clutches of his monstrous uncle, all while positioning himself to claim the very fiancé he had uncovered through an act of violent destruction. Ilara felt the floor drop out from under her, the brief clarity she had gained, the fragile sense of agency she had started to build, evaporated in the face of this calculated, public assault. How could she fight this? He had a signed document, twisted to his purpose. She had nothing but her word, the word of a poor girl who had agreed to be part of a bizarre negocio from the very beginning. To the outside world, she would look like an opportunist or a fool, easily manipulated by either man. She didn't have to wait long for the storm to break. The billionaire, Mr. Thorne, summoned her to the library that evening. The air in the room crackled with a controlled, glacial fury. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't shouting. He sat behind his massive desk, the legal notice from Liam's lawyers laid out before him like a declaration of war. His stillness was more menacing than any outburst could ever be. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he wasn't looking through her, but directly at her, assessing her resolve. "My nephew," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "has a fatal misunderstanding of how power works. He thinks a piece of paper and a hired attorney grant him leverage. He confuses nuisance with strategy." He tapped a single finger on the document. "He is attempting to lay claim to a trust established by my late wife. He is using you as his key, and this fabricated story of guardianship as his crowbar." Ilara stood before him, clutching her hands together. "What can I do? I have no dinero, no way to fight him." "You are mistaken," Thorne said, his eyes locking with hers. "You are not fighting him. We are." The word hung in the air between them, unexpected and profound. We. It was the first time he had ever aligned himself with her, the first crack in the wall of isolation he had so carefully constructed. He saw the shock and suspicion on her face. "Do not misunderstand me," he clarified, his tone sharpening again. "This is not sentiment. My nephew has desecrated a memory. He has attempted to pervert my wife's final wishes into a tool for his own pathetic greed. He seeks to turn her legacy, the only clean and beautiful thing left from that time, into common capital for him to squander. I will not allow it. Therefore, your interests and my own are, for the moment, perfectly aligned." The next morning, two lawyers arrived at the mansion. They were not the kind of lawyers Liam could ever afford. They moved with an aura of quiet, lethal competence, their bespoke suits a stark contrast to Ilara's simple clothes. They sat with her in the library, Thorne present but silent, observing from his chair by the window. They asked her to recount everything, from the day Liam confessed his betrayal to the night he destroyed the conservatory. As she spoke, handing over the hidden diary and the documents from the box, she felt a strange shift. She wasn't a defendant pleading her case. She was a witness, providing the ammunition for a battle she was no longer fighting alone. The lawyers listened without judgment, their questions precise and insightful. They examined the trust documents, their expressions grim. The trust's activos are considerable. One of them, a sharp woman named Miss Jennings, explained, "It's not just cash. It includes a portfolio of actions and other aplicações that have grown significantly over the years. The rentabilidade has been managed by Mr. Thorne's firm. It's a substantial fortuna." She looked from the documents to Ilara. "Liam's claim is audacious, but his angle is clear. He will argue that you are the intended beneficiary and that, as your supposed protector, he should manage these bens on your behalf." "He will fail," Thorne stated from the window, his voice leaving no room for argument. It wasn't a hope, it was a fact. It was the voice of a billionario for whom the world was not a series of chances, but a series of levers to be pulled. The entire weight of his immense financial empire, his vast patrimonio liquido, was now being mobilized not for lucro, but for a war of principle. The fight was no longer about a small debt, it was about legacy, honor, and the complete and utter annihilation of his nephew's malicious scheme. The lawyers spent the next few days building their case, and in that time, the atmosphere in the mansion changed. The cold silence was replaced by the low hum of strategy. Ilara was no longer a ghost in the halls. She was a central piece of the puzzle, and Thorne treated her as such. He began to speak to her of his wife, not in long, emotional speeches, but in small, telling fragments. A comment about a book she loved, a mention of a piece of music she used to play on the piano in the locked wing. He was slowly, cautiously, letting her see the man from the diary. He was trusting her with his grief. The final summons arrived a week later. A formal meeting was set. All parties were to convene at the downtown offices of Thorne's legal firm. It was time for the final showdown. The night before, Ilara found Thorne standing in the doorway of the conservatory, looking at the recovering plants. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked, his back still to her. "I'm terrified," she admitted honestly. He turned, and in the soft moonlight filtering through the glass, his expression was softer than she had ever seen it. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said quietly. "It is the refusal to be defined by it. My wife taught me that." It was the closest he had ever come to offering comfort, a silent acknowledgement that they were standing together on the edge of a precipice, ready for the final, decisive fall. The law office was a world of polished mahogany, muted tones, and the hushed, expensive silence of corporate power. It was a sterile battlefield, chosen for its lack of emotion, a place where lives were dismantled and reassembled through clauses and precedents. Ilara sat beside Mr. Thorne at a long, gleaming table, his legal team flanking them like a silent, formidable guard. Across from them sat Liam, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was dressed in a suit he couldn't afford, playing the role of the aggrieved party, the concerned fiancé fighting for the woman he loved. His lawyer, a man with a hungry look in his eyes, began, his voice smooth and practiced. He laid out their case with theatrical sympathy, portraying Ilara as a fragile, easily influenced young woman caught in the web of a manipulative billionario. He presented the prenuptial agreement, highlighting the clauses about mutual bends and shared decision-making, twisting them into a document of guardianship. "My client, Mr. Vance," the lawyer said, gesturing to Liam, seeks only to protect Ms. Ilara, to ensure her best interests are met and to shield her from the undue influence of a man who has already demonstrated his willingness to use his immense fortuna as a weapon. Liam nodded gravely, his eyes fixed on Ilara, a look of faux concern etched on his face. It was a masterful performance of deceit. When it was their turn, Mrs. Jennings, Thorne's lead counsel, spoke with a calm, cutting precision that made Liam's lawyer seem like a cheap stage actor. She systematically dismantled their arguments, but the final, most crucial pieces of the puzzle were not hers to place. All eyes turned to Thorne as he spoke for the first time, his voice filling the room with an authority that money alone could not buy. "My nephew's claim is predicated on two falsehoods," Thorne began, his gaze fixed on Liam, who shifted uncomfortably. "The first is that he has any genuine concern for this young woman. The second, and far more significant, is that his connection to her is the most important one in this room." Liam scoffed. "This is about me and Ilara. You forced her into this situation to settle a negocio that went sour. This is about protecting her from you." Thorne allowed a cold, thin smile to touch his lips. "This was never about your trivial debt. It was about a promise I made to my wife on her deathbed." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "A promise to find her family." A confused frown creased Liam's forehead. Thorne's lawyers placed a new set of documents on the table. They weren't financial records or business contracts. They were birth certificates, old photographs, and a meticulously researched family tree. "My wife, Catherine, had a sister," Thorne continued, his voice steady but laced with the deep ache of memory. "Decades ago, a bitter family dispute caused a rift. Her sister was cast out, her name erased from the family records. She had a daughter, who then had a daughter of her own. A branch of the family we believed was lost forever." He looked directly at Ilara, and for the first time, his eyes held not calculation or grief, but a profound, almost paternal tenderness. "Ilara is not just some girl you found. She is Catherine's grandniece. She is the last living blood relative of the woman you have sought to dishonor." The air was sucked out of the room. Liam's face went white, the smug confidence draining away to be replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. He had known. The documents proved it. His own private investigator's report was among the papers, revealing he had discovered this hidden connection months ago. It wasn't a random choice. He had targeted Ilara, seeing her lineage not as a miracle, but as the ultimate leverage. He had planned to use his own cousin to manipulate his uncle. "You see," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, lethal and final, "I have been searching for her for years. Fulfilling that promise was the only purpose I had left. My cruelty, my tests, they were a shield, drowning in my grief and surrounded by sycophants like you. I used my reputation to keep the world at bay until I could find her. I had to be certain she possessed the same strength, the same integrity as Catherine. I had to be sure she wasn't another vulture seeking to pick apart my wife's FIANCÉ. I put her through an agonizing trial not to break her, but to see her spirit. And unlike you, she did not bend." With that final revelation, Liam's entire case didn't just collapse, it was annihilated. The prenuptial agreement was rendered meaningless, his claims of guardianship exposed as a fraudulent, premeditated attempt at extortion. The trust, established by his great-aunt, was now clearly intended for her last living relative. Ilara, Miss Jennings, spoke again, her voice crisp and final. "We will be filing criminal charges for fraud, extortion and trespassing, along with a civil suit for damages related to the destruction of private property. Mr. Vance, you are utterly and completely ruined." Ilara sat in stunned silence, the words washing over her. She was not the poor girl sold to a cruel billionaire. She was the rightful heir to a legacy of love and resilience, the answer to a dying woman's wish, the object of a heartbroken man's desperate years-long search. Her life had not begun in that cold mansion. It had, in the most unexpected way imaginable, brought her home. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sharp scrape of a chair as Liam, his face the color of ash, was escorted from the room by security. He didn't look at Ilara. He couldn't. His entire world, built on a foundation of deceit and entitlement, had been reduced to rubble. He was no longer a player in a high-stakes game of negocios and manipulation. He was just a common criminal facing the cold, hard consequences of his greed. The immense patrimonio he had schemed to control had become the very instrument of his destruction. The car ride back to the estate was a study in a new kind of silence. It was not the oppressive, cold quiet of their previous encounters, but one thick with unspoken history and the fragile beginnings of a future. Ilara stared out the window, watching the city blur past, her mind a whirlwind of revelations. She was family. She belonged. The concepts were so foreign, so overwhelming that she couldn't fully grasp them. For her entire life, she had been defined by what she lacked: family, security, dinero. Now, she was the heir to a legacy, a herança that went far beyond mere dólares or a portfolio of ações. Halfway through the journey, Thorne spoke, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual icy authority. He never understood, he said, more to himself than to her. He saw Catherine's trust as just another collection of ativos to be liquidated, another source of capital for his pathetic schemes. He never saw that its true value wasn't in its rentabilidad or its dividendos. It was in the intention behind it. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the rearview mirror. It was her way of ensuring that her spirit of creation, of nurturing life, would continue. It was a test for the future. A test you passed without even knowing you were taking it. When they arrived back at the mansion, the imposing gates swung open not to a prison, but to something else entirely. It was a place of memory, of sorrow, but also, now, of connection, a home. The staff greeted them with a new deference, their eyes holding a genuine warmth that had been absent before. Ilara walked through the marble halls, her footsteps no longer the timid echoes of a captive, but the quiet, steady steps of someone who belonged. She found herself drawn, as always, to the conservatory. The signs of Liam's destructive rampage were still visible, scars on the stone floor, a few empty shelves where pots had once sat. But the space was no longer a scene of devastation. The staff, on Thorne's orders, had already begun the careful work of cleaning up. Damaged plants had been repotted, soil swept away, and the broken shards of terracotta removed. Life was already reasserting itself. Thorne followed her into the glass house, stopping a few feet behind her. He looked at the chaos that had been tamed, his jaw tight. "He will pay for this," he said. The words, a low, steel promise. "Some things can't be paid for," Ilara whispered, kneeling beside the large, pieced-together planter that had once held the rare orchid. She gently touched a leaf, her heart aching for the violence the plant had endured. "Dunno," Thorne agreed, his voice softening. "They can't." He walked over and knelt beside her, an act of shared vulnerability that would have been unthinkable just days before. "My wife believed that everything, no matter how broken, could be coaxed back to life with enough care. She would have seen this not as an end, but as a challenge." His gaze fell upon the orchid. In the center of the repaired pot, nestled among the carefully resettled roots, was a sight that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. A single new shoot, a vibrant, determined green, was pushing its way upward, and at its very tip, a tiny, tightly closed bud was beginning to form. It was a small, almost imperceptible thing, but in the quiet of the conservatory, it felt like a miracle, a promise of a bloom against all odds. Ilara looked from the bud to the man beside her, the formidable billionario. The master of a global empire whose every decision could shift the Bolsa de Valores was looking at the tiny bud with an expression of raw, unshielded hope. The cold armor was gone, replaced by the quiet reverence of a man witnessing the first sign of spring after a long, brutal winter. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning, not with the signing of a contract or the transfer of a vast fortune, but with the slow, earned healing of two souls and the quiet promise of a single flower. The weeks that followed were a quiet unlearning. Ilara had to unlearn the fear that had been her constant companion, and Thorn had to unlearn the cold, hard solitude that had been his armor for so long. The vast mansion, once a symbol of her imprisonment, slowly began to feel like a home. The locked wing was opened, not as a shrine to what was lost, but as a living part of the house again. Ilara would often find Thorn there, not staring blankly at memories, but sitting at the piano, his fingers hesitantly tracing the keys, trying to recall the melodies his wife once played. Their conversations began in the conservatory, spoken over the simple, shared work of tending to the plants. He would tell her stories about Catherine, small, intimate details that weren't in the diary. He spoke of her mischievous laugh, her terrible singing voice, and her unwavering belief that there was good in everyone. A belief he had long since abandoned, but was slowly, cautiously, rediscovering through Ilara. In return, Ilara shared her own quiet dreams, ideas she had never dared to voice before. She spoke of art, of creating community gardens in impoverished neighborhoods, of using a portion of the Trust's future render to fund scholarships for young artists who, like her, came from nothing. Thorn listened, not with the detached analysis of a billionario assessing an investimento, but with genuine interest. He saw in her ideas the same spirit of creation and compassion that had defined his wife. For the first time in years, the vast patrimonio he controlled felt less like a burden and more like a tool, a source of capital that could be used not just to generate more lucro, but to build a meaningful legacy. He began involving her in discussions about the trust, showing her the portfolio of ações and fundos, explaining the concepts of dividendos and long-term growth not as a lesson in finance, but as a transfer of stewardship. He was entrusting her with his wife's final wish. One morning, they walked into the conservatory together, a comfortable silence between them. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming life. Their eyes went, as they always did, to the rare orchid, the single bud, which had been a tight, green promise for weeks, had finally begun to unfurl. Its petals, a shade of deep, velvety purple streaked with veins of pure white, were peeling back to reveal the intricate, delicate beauty within. It was more stunning than Ilara could have ever imagined. It was not just a flower, it was a testament, a symbol of resilience, a promise kept across the veil of time, and the physical manifestation of a love that had refused to die. Thorn reached out, his hand hovering just above the bloom, as if afraid to touch something so sacred. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, the first Ilara had ever seen him shed. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He looked at Ilara, his eyes clear of the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. "She would have loved you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. They were no longer a man and the girl he had tested, but two members of a family, reunited by a twist of fate and bound by a shared love for the woman who had connected them. The story of the poor girl sold to a cruel billionaire had ended. In its place, a new one was being written. It was the story of a woman who found her strength in the dirt of a forgotten garden, and a man who found his heart again in the legacy his wife left behind. Together, in the quiet light of the conservatory, they stood not as fairy tale lovers, but as partners, guardians of a legacy of love. The thriving orchid before them was the first page of their new chapter, a living symbol that the truest riqueza isn't measured in dólares or euro, but in the quiet, resilient beauty that can bloom from the most broken ground. If this story of resilience and unexpected connection touched your heart, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next incredible story.